Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, this is Gabe Lyons. Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. And today it's an extra long episode because we're talking about something that's so important. It's the conversation of the day. It's been the conversation happening all around you personally. It's happening corporately. It's happening nationally and globally. And that is this conversation around the pandemic. All of the different effects of it over this last year, everything from the lockdowns to policy, to the sickness itself, to vaccines, and how do we move forward? How do we move forward in an age where the whole world has experienced something new? They've had to deal with it. And now we look back over the last year and we can ask some really good questions. We can learn from this. We can keep getting smarter and stronger so that as we move forward, we're more intelligent, we're more capable, we're more confident about how we lead into the future. And so today what we've done is we've put together 4 different talks that were all part of this conversation. And you can't just listen to any one of these talks alone and really grasp what we were accomplishing this year at Q Ideas. It was a classic moment for us. What we wanted to do was talk to expert scientists. We wanted to talk to people like Dr. Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, holds the highest position in our government responding to this. Dr. Anthony Fauci works for him. And so we wanted to talk to him at the top to just understand how do we move forward? How do we talk about vaccine hesitancy, something that's been a big issue and something that needs to be discussed? And there are big questions that we wanted to ask him and hear his responses. We also had Dr. Martin Kulldorff, who's an epidemiologist at Harvard. He's responsible for the Great Barrington Declaration, something that over the last year laid out a different policy approach to protect the most vulnerable but not lock down entire societies. So it creates a bit of debate to hear these different doctors, what their perspectives are on how we should respond. And of course, we talked about vaccines with both of them. We then talked to a journalist, Alex Berenson, to describe over the last year what's happened in journalism. Why is it that we don't know who to trust anymore? Why are there multiple versions of it seems to be the same story? And we're all trying to sort through that. So we wanted to be curious and try to understand what's happening with the science. How does it apply to every single one of these issues, from lockdowns to the mask to vaccines, etc. And then we also talked to Naomi Schaefer Riley. She's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and she focuses on issues regarding child welfare. And we wanted to understand from her what has been the impact on our kids, what has been the impact on the most vulnerable because of the policies that we've put in place over this last year. As Christians, we must be concerned with the common good. We have to care about human flourishing. We have to ask the difficult questions. And our governments don't get a pass when they don't make the right decisions, or when we do see fallout taking place from policies that have been put in place. We have to question that. We've done that for years. And at this particular event, we wanted to think well about this because we know if there is another pandemic, if there is a future policy decision to be made, we have to learn now so that we prevent more problems in the future. And so she writes about parenting, higher education, religion, philanthropy, and culture, author of 6 books. But she is an incredible source for us to better understand how this has impacted our children. Now, as you're listening to this, if you're going, I want to watch this, I want to enjoy seeing this maybe with my family, friends, over the holiday weekend, I want to just sit back and take all this in. You can do that on Q Media, and we offer a free trial. So for 30 days, the next 30 days, you can have access not only to these talks, but hundreds of other talks around a variety of issues you'll find very compelling. And you can go do that at qideas.org/trial. When you go there, you'll get 30 days free, and you can enjoy watching these talks and having conversation around them. But for now, let's listen in to the conversation on the pandemic.
I told you we wouldn't shy away from the difficult conversations and issues, and we're not doing that in this session. In fact, what we're going to do is have a couple of conversations here related to science, related to what we're learning about vaccines and COVID. As Christians, we want to better understand this. We want to think well. We aren't anti-intellectual, we're quite intellectual. And so I'm so excited to have with us today Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Francis Collins As the director of the National Institutes of Health in 2009, in this role, Dr. Collins oversees the work of the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. He's a physician geneticist noted for his landmark discoveries of disease genes and his leadership of the Human Genome Project. Aside from being a physician and a scientist, he's also an evangelical Christian who has publicly encouraged Christians to get a COVID vaccine. And so I'm so grateful, Dr. Collins, that you would join us today for this conversation because we want to talk to the best. We want to talk to the man who's been in charge and leading in this effort over this last year. And there's no question, as we engage this conversation, one of the big elephants in the room, and I would say elephants in the world, is this vaccine. And it's this question of 45%, we see the data, 45% of white evangelicals are vaccine hesitant. And what we want to do is talk about that today and give you the opportunity to respond to that, give us an opportunity to hear from you, your responses to some of the reasons people are hesitant. And so thank you for being with us. CBS poll showed us this. 58% said that's still too untested. They want to wait and see. 47% said they're worried about side effects. 37% said they don't trust the government. 28% don't trust the people who make it. And so let's jump right in. First, could you explain to us why taking this shot is necessary, especially when it, as a disease, 99.5% is the median of the harm that it seems to do. So why is it necessary for everybody to take the vaccine?
Well, Gabe, thanks for the chance to have this conversation with you. I'm really honored to be part of Q this year, and I've been with you once before, but it's been quite a while. And I'm glad we're having this conversation because there's a lot at stake. More than 560,000 people have died in the United States alone from COVID-19. So while it is true that many people do get through this, and perhaps your 99.5% makes people think, well, it's not such a big deal, for all those families who've lost loved ones, and there have been many, many of them, 560,000 plus, this is a very serious threat to human survival. And it's even a little more significant for younger people than we once thought. The new variants that are now appearing, like this B117, which is now spreading really rapidly through Michigan, does have a more contagious and a more lethal aspect to it. And if you look to see who's now getting hospitalized with COVID-19, it's fewer of the people over 65 because they've gotten vaccinated. Now it's younger people, and some of them are in the ICU and some of them are dying. On top of that, we are learning that COVID-19 also can have a long tail of consequences that we didn't expect. Most respiratory viruses, if you get through it a couple weeks, you're kind of back to where you were. Maybe a third of people with COVID-19, including young people who had mild illnesses, aren't getting better. They're still fatigued. They're short of breath. They have headaches. They have this brain fog that makes it hard to really get your mind working the way you want it to. We don't understand that yet, and in some instances, that seems to be quite prolonged over months. So there are all kinds of reasons to avoid letting this virus have its way with us.
Yeah.
And the vaccine is the best strategy we've got right now to end the virus's success. And it's been very successful so far.
Well, I think part of the hesitancy on some people's behalf is the idea that they've already had COVID. They've already developed T-cell immunity. There's plenty of people who've written about the fact that if you've already had COVID, that should last for 10 years. I think the SARS study showed that it could last up to 17 years. And so they're wondering, why would they need to get a vaccine if they've actually already had the disease?
Well, again, the data is what we ought to be looking at. And it does look as if you can get COVID-19 again. If you look in Denmark, where we have long experience because they had a pretty bad outbreak a year ago, people who had it, was clearly documented that they had it, are getting infected again. We've seen that also in South Africa. It turns out the vaccine provides better protection than the natural infection. And that sounds surprising to people. But if you think about it, the natural infection, it's in your nose, in your respiratory tract. Your immune system sees it, but it doesn't really see it the way it does as if you've had the vaccine injected into muscle cells and your whole body gets put on alert. So if you really want the better protection, the vaccine is the way to go, which is why people have had COVID-19, like the former president of the United States, are still recommended to get vaccination, which he did.
Yeah, so one of the challenges we saw in that research is there's just simply this distrust in government right now. Yes. I think that's probably been around for a while, but there's this distrust in government, there's a distrust in the pharmaceutical makers. And one of the facts is the pharmaceutical companies have zero liability. So no matter what happens from these vaccines, the side effects, if there's deaths, anything that takes place, nobody has the right to go back and sue them. So I think that's part of what creates distrust. Then there's the stories that Moderna and NIH, the institution you run, owns, you own half the patent, NIH does, to that. So it starts to raise these questions of, is the government looking out for my best interest? Are pharmaceutical companies looking out for my best interest when I actually have no right to go back if I actually have a problem? How would you reassure Americans who are concerned about that?
Well, I would just ask people to look at the evidence. I mean, isn't that really how we make decisions? And as Christians, aren't we particularly called to assess what's the truth of the matter and get beyond a lot of the things that are out there on the internet that may or may not be based on truth? We have never had vaccines scrutinized with such transparent care as these. We've never had vaccines tested in at least 30,000 people before they were considered approvable by the FDA. All of the data on those trials is up there for everybody to look at. You can look at it today. It was discussed in a public meeting. It's judged by scientists who are not hired by the government or the companies, who are just basically there to look at the evidence. And out of this comes the conclusion that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine are 95% effective and have a remarkably good safety record. And, people are now walking around who were part of those trials. They're 9 months out from immunization, and there is no evidence of any late side effect either. So, yeah, I get it. If you want to look for reasons that anything you put in front of you might have some sort of background that makes it not quite sound right, you can find those. But look at the data for what this is. I'm a Christian. I think God gives us the opportunity through science to figure out ways to avoid healing and avoid suffering and avoid death. And the vaccines that have come forward seem to me like an answer to prayer. And we ought to embrace that idea as well, that we've been given a chance here to avoid a much worse outcome. It's been bad enough already. Do we really want this to go on and on and on because we're resistant to what God has provided as a gift? Are we like the guy who is drowning or about to drown on his roof, and somebody came by to rescue him, and he said, "No, God will take care of me"? And he died anyway, and he went to St. Peter and said, "I expected God to come and save me." And St. Peter said, "Yeah, God sent that guy to rescue you, and you turned him down." We have this opportunity now to take advantage of a wonderful gift from science, which I believe is a gift from God. Why are we as Christians being so particularly resistant to the opportunity when it's a love your neighbor moment?
Well, I think probably part of the hesitancy has just been that this lack of trust exists. I mean, that's likely why the CDC and others have gone to churches to try to convince their communities of something the public health community hasn't been able to convince them of. And so it's created this tension, and it's made them question, because they are looking at the science. They're not as concerned about getting sick. They're seeing the data, and they're seeing that the data hasn't played out the way this originally looked like it would take 3% of lives. They're starting to see how it's worked out, and we've had a whole year to look at that. So I think that's part of it. When you describe the miracle that's been given, I think you're referring to mRNA, which is part of this new technology that's been advanced, which is why all this has been able to happen so fast. Could you describe for people what is mRNA technology so that they can better understand it?
Sure, Dave. And people, I think, are also worried this happened so fast, and maybe mRNA just got invented as a vaccine last January 2020. It was 25 years of research to understand how this might be a more efficient and rapid way to build a vaccine. So a little bit of molecular biology 101. The way in which proteins get made is there's a DNA that codes for it, and then there's messenger RNA that carries that information to a part of the cell called the ribosome, and then it gets translated into protein. So what we are trying to do here in terms of immunization is to make the immune system recognize this virus without having to get infected. These spike proteins are the things the immune system needs to see. So instead of injecting the spike protein, which you could do, Novavax has a vaccine like that that's under review right now, How about you inject the messenger RNA that codes for that, and then you ask the muscle cells, which know what to do with messenger RNA, to make the protein for you. Turns out you can make that more quickly than doing the protein prep, which is months and months of work. And in fact, it works incredibly well. And the safety issues, which I guess everybody should think about because it's a new approach, have turned out in now millions and millions of people to be actually extremely reassuring. There's nothing about this that seems to create a surprise. So it's if you want to make a vaccine in a hurry, and remember all those people who started dying a year ago. The idea that we would want to be going on a slow boat when there is this terrible virus that's causing death and destruction, you wouldn't want to do that. You want to do it as quickly as you can. And answer to prayer, this particular approach did produce in less than a year vaccines that are safe and effective. That's never been done before in less than about 5 years. And shouldn't we be celebrating that? I know people worry that means you cut corners. Believe me, as the NIH director, the only corners we cut were getting the bureaucratic steps out of the way that normally slow the process down. There was no corners cut about safety or efficacy.
Well, I think people are seeing that, as they take a new technology like this and they're putting it into their bodies, they are concerned. Some have described it as, they feel like they're part of an experiment because there really hasn't been long-term testing. And I'm pushing on this because I think it deserves really good answers because people are concerned, and if the NIH and CDC and our government wants less people to be hesitant, we've got to answer some of these real fundamental questions.
Yes.
The VAERS reporting data, for example, just to look at the data, there's 3,486 deaths that have been reported as vaccine deaths. Now, the World Health Organization has said there's 0 deaths from this vaccine. I know that's self-reported, it's doctors reporting, but that is an enormous number of deaths that people are seeing come close to and related to, within days or weeks of a vaccine going forward. How would you reassure people that they really should believe there is not going to be any side effects?
It's very difficult, of course, when you're talking about something that's been given now to more than 100 million people, to figure out what is cause and effect if something happens when you have that number of people where something's going to happen by chance. The real way that you can determine this is by what we did at the outset of testing these vaccines, which is to have a randomized placebo-controlled trial. Some people got the vaccine, some people got an injection. It was actually salt water. They didn't know which one they got. The people administering it didn't know which one they were giving, but there was a code. That's the only way you can tell the difference between coincidence and cause and effect. And in this instance, the trials were at least 30,000 people, and there were no premature deaths, and there still aren't. Those people are still being followed. So when you hear about deaths that have happened for 100 million people, you got to say to yourself, wait a minute, in any given interval of a few months, how many people would you expect might die from natural causes? It's going to be thousands. So to draw the conclusion that that's because of the vaccine is jumping a hoop that one shouldn't jump. And the way you really tell the difference is to look at the randomized control trial. That's why we do those trials, even though people wonder, what? I'm getting a saltwater injection? Yeah, that's the only way. Thank you, people, for participating in these trials. That's the only way we know.
Yeah. Well, final question. It looks like children, teens, and young adults, there's been more messaging towards children should be getting vaccinated, that potentially going back to school in the fall, this should become part of the vaccine schedule. Is this something that you believe should be mandated? Is there parents that are looking at this realizing children have virtually zero risk from this disease? Why would we want our children to take, again, a vaccine that's under emergency authorization approval, that's not been FDA approved yet? Why would we want to give that to our children and our teens?
Well, it's the right question. What are the benefits and what are the risks? Isn't that what we're always asking? Yeah. First of all, I don't think it's correct to say children have zero risk. Hundreds of kids have died of COVID-19. You don't hear about that much because it is rare. This thing that I talked about, these long-term consequences of mild illness with COVID, so-called long COVID, kids get that too. We're only beginning to appreciate how often that happens to children whose then school performance plummets because they've got this brain fog. This is not a benign illness. in the longer term or the short term, even for kids. Now recognize at the moment, the vaccines are not approved for kids under 16. There's a trial that has been done for kids down to age 12. FDA is looking at that data right now, again to say, in a very well-designed trial, was it safe? Was it effective? Were there any surprises as far as side effects? We'll have to see what happens. Trials on younger kids are underway, but we don't know the results. So watch the data to see. But let nobody say that this is a disease that children have no risk from. That's simply not the case. The risk is lower than adults, but if it's your kid and they get COVID-19 and that could have been prevented by a vaccine, that's a tragedy. So please, Christians, you are people of truth. I know that. And I believe that when the answers are needed, you figure out how to go and seek that truth prayerfully, asking God to open all of our eyes to this. And I do think this is a moment for Christians to lead and for Christians to be seen as the most resistant group. I think that also doesn't speak well for people who are wondering about whether they should trust the church. If the church is actually standing up in a way that sounds like it's denying the truth from science, is that what young people really want to join up to? So think about those consequences. I know I'm speaking bluntly here, but that's what Q is all about. If we are followers of Jesus, we have to be followers who are unafraid to speak the truth and to find the truth, and not to be misled by other kinds of comments or conspiracies that simply don't represent what God has called us to in terms of seeking out the real answers.
Well, thank you, Dr. Collins. I love you being willing to speak bluntly. It's such an important conversation, and this particular group that I know is assembled today value hearing your insights as we could hear from no one else. So thank you for being with us. Let's thank Dr. Collins for joining us. Thank you. So as you can tell, we're going to get into these questions. We got to understand these things better. We got to talk to the people who understand it and help us know how to have better conversations and go look at the data ourselves, try to appreciate and understand it. I know in all of our church communities, this kind of dialogue is happening. It's one of those things that has become so mainstream to conversation. Are you vaccinated? Are you going to get vaccinated? Did you get vaccinated? And we know that the white evangelical community is one that is resistant. I want to bring in to the conversation now another doctor, Harvard scientist and epidemiologist, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, world-renowned for his epidemiology and understanding of diseases and viruses and how they spread. His expertise is in detecting and monitoring infectious disease outbreaks and vaccine safety evaluations. He's part of the COVID-19 Vaccine Safety Technical Subgroup, the organization that the CDC, NIH, and FDA rely on for oversight on the safety of vaccines. In October of 2020, he came alongside a Stanford scientist as well as an Oxford scientist, and they created something called the Great Barrington Declaration. It was a different approach that said, for the sake of public health, lockdowns are not the way to go. We need to have a different approach, a different strategy where we protect the vulnerable. And so we're gonna welcome in Dr. Martin Kulldorff to join us. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Kulldorff.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
So you and 14,000 other medical public health scientists have had a very different approach to this pandemic. And in fact, your Great Barrington Declaration that you launched last summer, people could sign it, and it became one of much momentum where 42,000 medical practitioners have signed your approach, but you had a different approach. You said, we don't think lockdowns and mass vaccination is the way to go. We think there's a different approach called focused protection. Could you describe for us that approach?
So the key thing with COVID is that while anybody can get infected, there's an enormous difference in the risk of mortality of death between the youngest and the oldest. So the older people have more than 1,000-fold higher risk of dying than young people. And that's something we have to utilize as we design a public health strategy. So one of the principles about public health is that you can't look only at one single disease like COVID. You have to look at diseases in general and health in general, both physical and mental health. So it's very important that to protect the older. And I think it's clear now that these lockdowns that were general through the whole population, they haven't protected older people. We have had, as Dr. Collins said, over 500,000 deaths just in the United States, which is very tragic. And the problem was that the naive belief that lockdowns would work to protect older people, which was not correct, that meant that more focused protection measures were never implemented.
Yeah.
For nursing homes, for multi-generational homes, for older people still in the workforce, and so on.
Yeah.
And that's what have led to so many deaths. At the same time, the lockdowns have created a lot of collateral public health damage. Children not going to school is not only bad for their education, but also for public and mental health.
We've had a conversation about that this morning where we've talked about some of the fallout from the lockdowns. I want to keep moving on because we have a short amount of time. Your background is epidemiology, so you understand the spread of disease. You also are a part of this COVID-19 vaccine evaluation process. But talk to us about just basic epidemiology. If somebody has already had COVID, do they need to get vaccinated?
So we have more evidence for the protection and immunity after natural infection than after a vaccine. So what we have to do is we have to prioritize vaccinating those that have not been sick. And if you have had COVID, you don't need the vaccine now. Maybe 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we don't know, but currently no.
So we are hearing too that both Pfizer and Moderna are going to require a third booster shot. So this was new information for some people over the last few weeks that this could become part of a cycle. Is that something from a vaccine, as you've looked at vaccine safety, why would there need to continually be boosters? It seems more like a flu shot.
Well, if the immunity from vaccines wanes over time, so we know that it was 95% shortly after vaccines, but if that goes down over time, then maybe there's a need for a booster shot. But I don't think we know that for certain yet.
What about the variants? That's another part from an epidemiologist perspective. We're hearing a lot about new variants. Dr. Collins was sharing about a new variant in Michigan. If somebody's had COVID, would that already cover them for those variants, or would vaccines be necessary? Do vaccines cover people for the variants?
So far, it looks like both the natural immunity from disease as well as the vaccines are covering variants also. But of course, we don't know what future variants we might see, but so far it looks fine.
So herd immunity seems to be the goal, right? That the majority of the population has herd immunity. And it seems like for the first time, we're trying to track herd immunity on the basis of vaccines, but not on the basis of somebody having already had COVID. Is that your take on it? Do you think it's necessary that the whole population get vaccinated?
So herd immunity is something that's going to happen no matter what, and that's how it's going to end the pandemic. And that's a combination of currently most of the immunity comes from natural infections and is being helped by vaccines. But that's what's going to end this pandemic.
So as you've thought about this and the policy going forward, thinking about children, college students, teenagers, we're seeing some colleges requiring that for students to come back. Do you think as we move forward, you've looked back and said we haven't responded correctly in the last year to this public health crisis. As you look forward, do you think the right approach is to require children to get vaccines before they come back to schools?
I think vaccine passports and vaccine mandates are very detrimental to public health for two reasons. One is it will entice younger people who are lower risk to grab those vaccines that are available before many older people get it. And we really have to focus on vaccinating the old, not only in the United States, but also around the world, because most other countries are behind the US in terms of vaccinating the older people. So we want to make sure that the vaccines available goes to the old. The other thing is that one of the basic principles of public health is trust. Both people have to trust public health officials and public health officials have to trust the population. And any form of coercion is damaging to that trust. And we're already seeing a lot of reduction in trust because of lockdowns and such. So vaccine passport and mandated vaccines is, I think, going to increase the vaccine hesitancy and vaccine skepticism because it's being coerced. So coercion is never a good approach in public health. It should be based on trust and voluntary participation.
You recently wrote a piece on that one of the greatest casualties of the last year and of lockdowns would be trust in science. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that the way we have approached this pandemic with ineffective lockdowns that has created a lot of collateral public health damage means that this is the biggest public health fiasco in history. And it's very natural that a lot of people are skeptical and don't have the trust in the politicians and the public health officials who have sent bad messages and created this situation for us. So it's very natural that skepticism exists. And it's going to take many years to rebuild that trust in science and public health, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've been told that there's a scientific consensus around so many of these policies, the way we should move forward, the way we should interact, what the next step is, should we wear masks, double mask, stay 6 feet apart, 3 feet apart. So this whole last year has created a lot of confusion for people as it relates to science, but we've been told there's consensus. As you sit as a scientist at Harvard, very respected around the world, working with world-renowned scientists, would you say there's consensus, or would you say there's a lack of consensus?
There's not consensus. Most of the infectious disease epidemiologists that I talk to on a personal basis do not believe that lockdowns are a good idea and think that we should do focused protection of primarily protecting the older people. But there has been a lot of silencing, censoring, and slander. So a lot of scientists do not dare to speak up. And I understand that they are afraid.
Yeah, you've been willing to speak up, and you've had some of that happen to you, but one of the things I know you shared with me that science needs is the ability to have open conversation, that scientists must be able to talk to one another. This is critical for us to have this open debate. Are you concerned that we're losing the opportunity to really bring the best of science to solve these kinds of problems?
Yeah, science is dependent on open discourse between scientists and public open discourse. And when people see that scientists are silenced or censored, that increases also the distrust in science. So it's a very bad situation that we have to find a way out of.
Yeah, one final question, because I know you're on the COVID-19 vaccine safety technical group, and we asked Dr. Collins this too, and want to hear from you. You know, it seems like the new conversation as we go into the summer and the fall will be children and teenagers getting vaccinated. Do you have concerns about long-term effects and that we haven't had enough time to understand what the possible problems could be from entering into something that hasn't had the time?
Well, the thing is, for older people, the advantage of the vaccine is so strong and so obvious that for older people, there should not be any hesitation about taking these vaccines. For children, the disease is very mild and it's less dangerous than the annual influenza. So, it's not clear whether you get better protection from or equal protection from vaccine as you do from the natural infection. So, and right now there are no vaccines for children, so that's something that we have to sort of sort out in due time. But older people definitely is very important for older people to get the vaccine because it will save many, many lives.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, thank you for your work. Thank you for your initiative with the Great Barrington Declaration that brought a different perspective, a different voice, some critical thinking to this conversation and how we should move forward. And we thank you for your service and look forward to seeing your continued work. Let's thank Dr. Martin Kulldorff for being with us.
Thank you very much.
So you have some things to talk about now, right? It got really quiet as we're engaging these conversations. I mean, our goal here is to ask the questions. We don't know where the answers might go, but we got to ask, we got to dig in, we got to think. I think as we move into this next conversation, it's going to be around truth in journalism. I think one of the effects of this last year is it started to expose that we don't know where to go. We don't know who to trust. You can have two doctors that are at the highest esteemed levels in our society have some varying opinions on certain data, certain science, certain reporting. There's content coming at us from 100 directions, and we don't know who to trust. And so for this next conversation, I've invited a journalist to come be with us to talk about what's happened in media, what's happened in journalism. Who can we trust? How does it relate to some of the stories that have been developing over this last year? His name is Alex Berenson. Alex was a New York Times reporter for a decade. During that time, one of the things he did cover was pharmaceuticals and drug companies. He understands this world of journalism more than most. He became a nonfiction writer and has also written several fiction books and novels as well. But over this last year, he found himself not being able to stay away from journalism, not being able to stay away from this first love of trying to report truth, trying to report the facts, trying to help people better understand what is happening around us. And so I've invited him here today for us to have more of a conversation about journalism and the facts from this last year. So would you join me in welcoming Alex Berenson? Alex, welcome. Let's just start with the elephant in the room here on journalism. What happened to journalism?
What Donald Trump happened to journalism?
Okay.
I mean, you know, I think there was a move towards more open partisanship even before him, but his election elevated or escalated that process, accelerated that process. Look, it was very hard to cover him. I think he did tell a lot of falsehoods, but the response of the media to be very aggressive about him and oftentimes to pick on things he or people said in his administration that weren't, intentionally false, but that might have been mistakes in a way that they never would have before, I think was a mistake. I think in general, you're better off allowing, public leaders of any stripe to make their case. And, you can put facts in your story or have people in your story, contradicting them. Yeah. But when you openly cross the line to say, this person is lying, this person is lying, it's hard to walk back from that. And you run the risk of being seen as partisan. Or maybe you don't run the risk. Maybe you want to be seen as partisan. Maybe that's what your audience wants. Yeah. Another major thing that happened in journalism and has happened in the last 20 years is that the Times and other places moved from more of an advertising-supported model to a subscription model. And in the old days, there was this fear that advertisers would sort of dominate coverage and you couldn't say anything bad about them. The Times didn't really have that problem because if, Bloomingdale's didn't want to advertise, it was just too bad for Bloomingdale's. It turns out that in reality, it's a lot harder to stand up to your subscribers when 98% of them feel one way, yeah. Which is sort of what the Times has become and what the Washington Post has become. And so there's a tendency to give those readers what they want.
Yeah, there's a built-in bias.
Yes.
And you're starting to understand that from these different institutions, kind of what their take is. You're getting the facts, you're getting a little bit of opinion. The stories that are being told maybe are slanted towards their readers.
When I worked there, which was 99 through 2010, look, there's an old line, and it's true about journalism, that the job of journalists is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So, story selection might have reflected that, and might have reflected sort of a New York liberal view of the world. But our job was to go out and report the stories accurately, write them in an unbiased way, and give the people, especially if it was going to be an investigative piece, who we were talking to a chance to respond. Yeah. A lot of that's gone out the window. Yeah. And there's just this move towards openly, trashing people. For the most part these days, I know that a lot of my colleagues hate me now, and I insist on either live interviews or everything done over email because I'm quite aware that they will try to trash me. Yeah. I actually, with The Atlantic, which wrote a piece about me.
Yeah, they called you the pandemic's wrongest man.
The pandemic's wrongest man, yes. Coming from them, that's a compliment. So that piece actually ran April Fool's Day, which was fitting. But I sort of trusted them that they said, here are our questions. I said, okay, I'll answer them. They then went to other people to try to sort of demolish my answers. They never came back to me and said, here's what people are saying. Do you have a response to this? I would never have done that as a reporter for the New York Times. That is journalistic malpractice, but it's now standard practice.
So over this last year, you did cover the pandemic. You've covered it daily using Twitter pretty much as your main outlet to get stories out, many times linking to stories, to research studies, to all kinds of data, where you can see that journalistic tact coming out. What is it, as you've looked at this last year, there's so many things about COVID that have been debated. You've heard two doctors talking about it. From the journalist perspective, I want to get into some of the specifics because you've dug into all these. So let's just bring up all of them. The first, origins of this virus.
Sure.
Was it bat? Does this come from a bat? Did it come from a laboratory? We saw Robert Redfield, former CDC director. People seem to now start to come around to this different idea, but journalists didn't seem to want to touch that.
That's right. So I would just, I'd contradict you on one thing, which is Twitter's been a very good avenue for me and an outlet for me, but I've written 4 booklets, which are really traditional journalism, which together are almost 30,000 words, which is, not quite a book length. But I think, one of the first one is about how we count deaths. The second one is about lockdowns and sort of the evidence for and against them and the history of them. The third one is about masks and whether or not they work. And then the newest one, which is arguably the most controversial one of all, is about vaccines and the mRNA vaccines. And, I really, on Twitter, there is a tendency sometimes, and I unfortunately share it too, you can be sarcastic and snippy at times. I try not to engage in, repeated back and forth arguments with people, but sometimes it does happen. The booklets are much more traditional journalism, and I think if you want to know what I really think about this, you need to read those. But to go back to your question, so the scientific consensus came out last March somehow that the coronavirus couldn't possibly have been the result of either a lab accident or intentional, behavior by the Chinese. It had to have come from an animal, probably a bat, possibly a bat, and then, another species, a so-called zoonotic transmission then to humans. And The Lancet, which is a esteemed journal, wrote a long piece about this that basically said, it can't be true that that was a lab accident, so no one can talk about this. There are many problems with saying that. Here are 3. We're more than a year out from this, and from the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, and no one has come up with any animal reservoir. There's been no evidence of an animal that was infected with SARS-CoV-2 or something very, very much like it that could have transmitted this to humans. When the original SARS came out, they were aware, the Chinese very quickly found out where what the animal host was, and they demonstrated it in a variety of ways. We haven't been able to do that. 2, one of the world's leading labs for researching bat coronaviruses is in Wuhan. And yet somehow that makes no difference to anybody who says that the lab accident theory is wrong. 3, this virus, when it emerged and became, infected humans, appears to have been almost optimized to infect human lung tissue. So how did that happen? And why is it that we can't find viruses sort of a generation or 2 generations up that would demonstrate intermediate steps? There are other issues as well, but I would just say this. To go back to the question of journalism, last year, some people were talking about this. In fact, Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, was talking about it. We were all called conspiracy theorists. You're a conspiracy theorist if you even say, not if you say, hey, the Chinese did this to hurt everybody, but just this could have been a lab accident, and the most likely lab is in China. Well, why was that discussion closed off? And what damage has it done that more than a year's gone by before we're allowed to actually raise the question?
All right, let's move on to another topic. We got a lot, so we got to move fast.
Okay.
PCR testing.
So PCR testing, basically the issue around PCR testing is a good way to find out whether someone's infected with the coronavirus. The issue around PCR testing is that it can find people who had the coronavirus, who've recovered from it, who have sort of fragments of coronavirus in their bodies. And because the test is so sensitive, you'll come back with a positive result. Then you have to quarantine, theoretically the people around you have to isolate, when in reality you weren't sick, or you are not sick at this time. You might never have even known you had it. So that leads to 2 things. It leads to this problem with, interfering with people's lives when you don't really need to. And it also leads to an overestimation probably of death counts. So by the way, I'm not one of these people who says that 90% of coronavirus deaths are not really coronavirus deaths. That's not true. There clearly were hundreds of thousands of excess deaths in the United States last year, and clearly most of those were coronavirus related. But because of the way the states death match, in other words, they'll look at everyone who died, and then they'll look at their coronavirus registries to see who was infected. And if you're on both those lists and the events occurred within 30 or in some cases 60 days of each other, you're just listed as a coronavirus death. The problem is, since as we know, most of the people who die of/with coronavirus are older and quite sick, you're going to wind up with people who just died coincidentally. It's sort of the vaccine issue in reverse. So this makes PCR testing makes the epidemic look much, I'm not going to say much, but it makes it look worse than it is.
Okay. So with testing, as you've dug into that, it could be creating false positives or essentially keeping people quarantined.
Sort of former positives more than false positives.
Okay. Let's move on to mask. That became the huge point this year, and I think it's still completely debated about how, it's become a symbol, like a signal that I love my neighbor well because I'm going to wear this. But scientifically, technically, what's the story on that?
So before I wrote about vaccines, this was the most controversial thing I said. Masks are useless. Okay, I'm not talking about N95 respirators, which are sort of medical grade, which you theoretically and should be fitted for before you wear. I'm talking about standard cloth or surgical masks. There is no evidence, and we've actually done a randomized controlled trial to try to find evidence that masks protect the wearer. And there is next to no evidence that they slow the transmission of the virus. And it's not just that you can see this on an individual study basis, you can see this nationally and internationally. When you look at countries that have mask mandates, there's no evidence that you see sort of the curves of the virus transmission in a number of cases go up and down at random, okay? Weather changes patterns of transmission. It's possible that really aggressive lockdowns really early can slow transmission if you want to live that way, if you want to live in China, where they're willing to put 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, you can have the kind of lockdown that might slow transmission. There is no evidence that masks stop transmission. And I will say this. If you go back and look at what Dr. Redfield said, what the Surgeon General of the United States at the time said, and what Anthony Fauci said last February of 2020, they said masks were useless when worn by civilians who weren't sick, okay? If you're sick, yes, you probably want to wear a mask. A, it probably catches some of your coughs, and B, it's a signal to other people, I'm sick, stay away from me. But ordinary people wearing ordinary masks, no evidence. And they said this repeatedly, okay? Then 6 weeks later, in early April, they'd completely changed their tune. The science did not change, so only one of two things is possible. What they've said is they were worried about a run on masks, that we didn't have enough masks, in part because the Chinese bought so many masks back in January and February of 2020, and that there was a worldwide shortage, okay? If that's true, then they lied. They knowingly lied about something that could have protected people to help healthcare workers. Now, you can say that helping healthcare workers was necessary at that time, but why would you trust them now if they're admitting they lied then? Second, the other possibility is that for some reason they just came around to the idea that this was something something positive that people can do, and B, would be a symbol of the seriousness of the coronavirus. And so in April of 2020, they told the truth before, but they decided to start lying then. Okay, they were either lying in February of 2020 or April of 2020. It's your choice because the science did not change.
Okay, on therapeutics, this is something that has been confusing over the last year. It didn't feel like there was a warp speed project to develop therapeutics, to test therapeutics, we've now learned things like vitamin D and other things when they're low, your immunity's suppressed. But there has been some success on some therapeutics, but it feels like that was quieted all last year. What's your take on that?
So I've tried to stay out of certain controversies like the HCQ controversy or the ivermectin controversy. There's not a lot of great randomized controlled trials showing that those work. You're right, we haven't made the progress on antivirals that we would have liked. There was an early study last April that seemed to show a drug called remdesivir worked, but the evidence for that has sort of grown steadily weaker over the last year. We do have two therapeutics that we know work. One is a very cheap steroid, which came out of testing out of the UK called dexamethasone, and the other is our monoclonal antibodies, okay? So that is basically a purified lab-grown antibody that can help you fight the coronavirus. And Eli Lilly has this product, Regeneron has this product. It's funny, people sometimes say like, I'm completely anti-pharmaceutical. I'm not against the industry at all. I just want them to do their jobs the right way. Both of those antibody products have been tested in clinical trials and shown to reduce deaths in older people. Why they're not standard of care for anybody who gets sick, I'm not entirely sure. But you're right. Like in terms of early stage therapeutics that a lot of people might be able to take that might have, be relatively inexpensive and have limited side effects, we haven't come up with anything good.
Well, a lot of people don't know, had we come up with something good, there could not be an emergency authorization for a vaccine.
That's correct, because an EUA is only supposed to be in effect if there are no treatments. Now, I would say it's an open question as to whether the antibodies actually might be good enough to stand in the way of that EUA, but they haven't been approved either. They're also under the EUA. The second question I'd say about the EUA is, are we in an emergency anymore? I mean, to the extent we were last March and April, that was the result of questions about, whether our medical system could handle the surge of cases that was predicted. If you go to Florida, if you go to Texas, there's no emergency. There's no, and it's not because they're under lockdown. It's because even at its worst, at its absolute worst, this virus did not really submerge the medical system anywhere. Even in New York City in March and April of last year, which was as bad as it could possibly be, the field hospitals did not fill up, and the hospitals were under a lot of pressure, but they never cracked. So where's the emergency?
All right, let's talk about vaccines, something less controversial that you've written about and we've talked about already today, but what is your take on the vaccines, the mRNA vaccine, its newness? How should we trust it? What are you seeing in the data and the report?
Dr. Collins said that this has been in development for 25 years. That's a very, very generous way to describe development. The mRNA vaccines were never tested in humans, I believe, before 2015. There was no testing. Here's the history of mRNA, okay? People understood the potential value of this technology for a long time. They couldn't figure out how to get it to human beings into their cells in a way that wouldn't kill them. Okay, that was the problem with mRNA. And so in the last 10 years, we've made a move towards, there's something called lipid nanoparticles. They're tiny little globs of fat. It's very complicated, but you get the mRNA inside this lipid nanoparticle. Then you can inject it into people and their immune systems don't go completely crazy, and you can actually deliver the mRNA to the cell where it's supposed to work its magic. The problem is that even now, multiple injections of these cause sort of cascading and worsening immune system reactions. That's why Moderna was not founded as a vaccine company. It was founded as a company that was going to make mRNA drugs for chronic conditions. They couldn't make that work. They switched to vaccines because vaccines are only supposed to need 1 or 2 shots to work. And as you're now hearing, and by the way, when we ran these very large clinical trials, which was a good thing, it's the best thing that's happened in vaccine development, they show very, very clearly that the second dose is much worse for people. The side effects are significantly worse. That's clear both in the real world and in the clinical trials.
What do you make of the VAERS data, the 3,400 reported vaccination deaths?
I think that's a very strong signal that should be followed. That's as many deaths have been reported to VAERS about the mRNA vaccines as in the previous 30-year history of VAERS for all other vaccines combined. That does not mean that the vaccines caused all those deaths, okay? What it does mean is that there is a risk that the vaccines caused some of those deaths.
Have you been impressed with how J&J and AstraZeneca, the community halted those?
Well, look, it's good that happened, but here's what Dr. Collins can tell you. Those vaccines went through exactly the same 30,000 patient clinical trial process as the mRNA vaccines, okay? And the vaccine trials did not pick up this signal. The reason that this has jumped out is because it is so rare in the wild, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, this blood clotting with low platelets phenomenon, that the companies could not argue that it was coincidence. For more common conditions, it gets harder and harder to pick up a safety signal. So in other words, if it's just a common stroke that these vaccines are causing, stroke is common enough that it's going to be very hard to pick up the signal even if thousands of additional people are dying from stroke. I'm not saying that we know that's happening. I'm telling you that that's a risk, and I'm telling you that when you go at warp speed, you do cut corners, okay? You don't do the preclinical work that you would normally do. Basically, what happened with vaccine development last year was the companies and the governments all over the world decided they were going to depend on these clinical trials to pick up very rare signals, and if nothing showed up, okay, so be it. We've already seen a failure as far as that goes with the J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines. So far, there's nothing that's popped out with the mRNAs. That doesn't mean it's not there. It means it hasn't popped in the same way.
All right, final question. The messaging seems to be on vaccines, get the vaccine so we can get back to normal. That this is a requirement to get back to what you're describing as like life in Florida. It's pretty normal. And when you look at some of these states, comparisons like California to Florida, and you look at the charts, they seem to run pretty similar. One was locked down, one was not. Right. So do you think we need to make this move? You're talking to 45%, a lot of white evangelicals who are hesitant about this. Do you think they should make that move to get back to normal?
So I think we should be normal now. I think we should all be living in Florida right now, okay? I think the churches should be open. I think the ballpark should be open. I think everything should be open, okay? And if you want to get vaccinated, look, my mom asked me if she should get vaccinated. I said, yes, she's 76 years old. She should get vaccinated. My kids are going to get this vaccine over my dead body, okay? Until we have some more data, all right? I'm in the middle. I'm 48. I don't really have any risks. I'm taking my chances with my immune system. I'm okay with that. I think this should be a personal choice. I don't think you should have to take a shot of a vaccine that's been around for approximately 13 months to get your rights back.
Well, Alex, I think you just violated HIPAA regulations by telling us all about your vaccine decision.
My mom's gonna sue me.
But yeah, your mom. But thank you. I know this conversation's a tough one, and it doesn't make a lot of people happy to hear this conversation happening. I said at the beginning, we're gonna have critical thinking. We're gonna ask questions wherever they lead. And so I just appreciate your willingness to come, be a part of this conversation, share with us what you're learning, and we'll let people for themselves decide and figure out like where they land on it.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, this is a friendly audience for me.
Yeah.
But no, the data, you know, Dr. Collins is right. The data is out there, and go look at what the adverse events in the phase 3 clinical trials were for yourself.
All right, well, let's thank Alex Berenson. Thank you. Thank you. What were some of the problems that existed before we went into a lockdown and then the lockdown exacerbated?
Well, the problems that we face in child welfare in this country are very large. There are a lot of children who are living in families where they are not safe. There's a lot of substance abuse in this country, and frankly, that crisis is driving our child welfare crisis. You're seeing children who are being neglected in all sorts of ways, who are being left alone at very young ages, who are not being cared for physically, emotionally, and the lockdown has exacerbated all of those problems.
Well, the lockdown idea was meant to be a public health intervention that actually helped, saved lives, helped people. When you look back on this last year through your lens, as we look at children, did that happen?
Well, I would say it, obviously in the first place, no one knew what was going on. So last spring, officials had to make all sorts of decisions about what seemed like the best course of action and the safest course of action. But what we learned was that shutting down schools had the effect of creating a different danger for kids. About at least 20% of the reports that come in to child welfare hotlines are coming from schools. Another significant percentage of those are coming from pediatricians. So as children didn't have their well visits with their doctors, and as children were not in schools, the reports to child welfare hotlines went down extraordinary rates. In New York City alone, they went down by more than 50%. Those are a lot of kids who are not being seen. And that's both in terms of, are there services we could provide for these families? Are they getting food that they need? Are they getting mental health counseling? If there's a substance abuse issue, are the parents able to access those services? Are children, having access to the kinds of, health services that they need? All these things which have to be weighed, those are safety and health concerns. COVID is not the only safe and healthy concern.
Yeah, and you've analyzed how this played out in education. And so many parents I know became homeschool parents instantly, had no ability or thinking they would ever do that. And then they figured it out and they tried to learn how to do this. There was online learning. There was a lot that took place. But as you said, children stopped showing up at schools. They stopped showing up in these educational environments. What's been the loss? What's the impact? Can we measure that yet? Do we even know what the impact has been?
We're starting to see, as different states are coming out of lockdown, just to give you a couple of examples, at the beginning of the alphabet, Arkansas and Alaska actually both saw very large increases in the number of emergency room visits due to child maltreatment. So what happens is, if you leave these issues for a long period of time unaddressed, they start to show up in more severe ways in our hospital settings. So I think you're starting to see that. A lot of people are predicting, and we're already seeing an increase in need for foster families in this country, because so many of these issues, again, have gone unaddressed at a lower level, that now it turns out they've escalated to the point where children need to be removed from their homes, and we need to find foster families who are willing to take them in.
Yeah, so now that children are back in schools, now teachers, doctors, people are starting to assess the situation, and they're realizing abuse has been taking place. What are some examples of how we're seeing that play out?
Well, I should say that there are still a lot of school districts, and unfortunately, they're some of the most vulnerable kids who are still not in school regularly right now, and who may not even be in school regularly in the fall. And we're seeing those in more often in minority communities. Black and Hispanic kids are less likely to be in school full-time in person now than white children are. And so those are the most vulnerable families sometimes. So we've talked about, of course, the learning loss and that's how those kids are falling behind. But the fact that they're not being seen and the fact that they're being isolated from their community is causing a great deal of problems.
Yeah, I saw the stat recently. It's 1.5 billion children around the world that lost a year of education.
Absolutely.
What are some of these other impacts that we're seeing beyond just the education and the learning side? I know we're talking about the reports of abuse, but what are some other factors that you've seen as you look back on this last year? Communities not coming together, people not seeing one another. I mean, some of what I hear you saying is the value of the community is important. The value of coming together, of being present with other people is critical. And when we go into some sort of a lockdown situation, we're cutting people off, we're isolating them, and then we lose touch. And we might lose kids forever in that situation.
The isolation that is coming to these children, especially you're seeing young children and adolescents, higher rates of anxiety and depression among these young people. You've seen some spikes in suicide, not necessarily overall rates in the whole country, but some shocking data about young kids who are having suicidal ideations. I mean, this notion that we can keep these kids in their homes by themselves, not let them see their peers, especially at a stage, I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. The idea of cutting them off from all their friends and imagining that there will be no effects on these kids. I mean, we know about the effects on adults, but when you sort of say to these kids, no, you're gonna stay in your home, you're gonna stare at a computer screen all day for a year, for 14 months, for 16 months, and imagine that there will be no long-term psychological impact is crazy.
You live in the New York area, so you experienced lockdown a little differently than maybe states in the South, like Florida, for example, and you wrote about this. You wrote about this comparison between what took place in these two environments. Could you describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I was curious about, and I think everyone was, is, what are the impacts in terms of health? And actually, in terms of deaths from COVID, New York did a lot worse, despite the fact that we had a much more severe lockdown. I think maybe we have a slide up there for that. You can see that. But I would add to that slide, New York also did worse among older people. You've heard about our nursing home scandals and the idea that, that we were not protecting our elderly in a way that actually Florida ended up doing. More importantly, I would say that this problem affected populations at different rates. As much as New York kept talking about racial disparities, if you are a black person in New York, you are 2.5 times as likely to die from COVID as if you were a black person living in Florida. I don't think anyone has come to terms with what the racial disparities in these policies really meant. You saw these disparities between New York and Florida in unemployment rates, and that unemployment is eventually funnels down to all the things we've been talking about. about, to economic stress, to stress in families, to mental health problems. So it's not just, people lost a job. There's a whole train that comes along with people losing a job. And then I was curious, Florida also opened its schools pretty quickly. I mean, now I think there are no schools in Florida that are remote. And in New York City, I mean, you could be a parent in New York City and still maybe get to send your kid to school one day a week these days, maybe. And the schools, moreover, by the way, have done an enormous disservice telling parents that school is unsafe for their kids. So you see a very large reluctance in some of the poorest minority communities in New York City to even send their kids back to school even when they're open, because the schools have been sending letters frightening them. And this is an enormous disservice, obviously, academically. But we can see the fact that these policies, had no positive health impact overall, and they had this enormous negative impact in terms of the isolation of families, the economic breakdown, and the social stress that has occurred.
Do you sense right now that public health experts and officials who've made some of these decisions are reflecting on that, are understanding some of the data that we're talking about here today and these overall impacts and seeing the whole picture? Or do you think at the public health level, the medical side, we're just looking at this from a COVID perspective?
I think we live in a very risk-averse society, and once you instill that fear in parents and families about what could happen to their children, it's very hard to take it back. And, I look around in New York, people who are fully vaccinated are standing outside talking to each other with 2 masks on and refuse to take them off, and, some of them still don't want their kids in school. So I hope that the public health experts are rethinking this, but it is going to take a long time to undo all of the messaging at this point. And I don't think we're being very good about the messaging on vaccines and how much that can really change your life, frankly. We're telling people, get vaccinated, but everything will still remain the same. And that's not the attitude in a lot of states like Florida or other southern states.
Yeah, we'll be talking later about vaccine hesitancy, why that might be, get some good answers, I think, on that topic in our next session. But we've talked about children. As we look at adults, deaths of despair was something we've talked about over the last few years that was already taking place throughout society. Overdosing, these kinds of problems were before we went into COVID, mental health was off the charts as a major concern for people. And then during COVID, I remember seeing at the end of the summer, the data, I believe, from the CDC that talked about suicidal thoughts. And I think ages 18 to 24, 25% had suicidal thoughts. I mean, that's 1 out of 4 of our college students, where at the end of that summer, they're not seeing purpose and meaning. And I think that's what fear starts to do, right? It starts to creep in. And for our children, as they try to look to the future all of a sudden feels so much more uncertain than at any point in our lifetime. Can you see why children have moved to this depressed place?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to, bring back all of the trauma for the audience members here, but I mean, the lockdown, it was waking up every day to the same thing. It was not being able to look forward to getting together with your family, to going to church or synagogue on the weekends, to having family celebrations. It felt like you never knew when things were going to get back to normal, and it was the same thing day in and day out. And that is the kind of thing that, leads people with perfectly good mental health to start to have these thoughts. But if you're already in a vulnerable state, if you've had addiction problems of some sort in the past, and now you can't have access to a meeting in person of people to support you, if you can't access professional services except over a computer, if you can't come together with your community, if you don't feel like you have those things to look forward to, you can really see why people who already had those problems fell back into those habits.
Yeah, and there's data that came out in 2019 that Barna did that describes how the church can play a role in this kind of moment. And I think for people listening today who are Christian leaders, they lead Christian communities, maybe they lead churches, or they're leading social service organizations, there's the opportunity right now like there's never been to step in. And what's interesting about the data is it shows that our non-Christian neighbors, when you ask them, what can the church do in your community? Like their first thing they talk about is child welfare, children after school, having something to do, having mentors, having a place to go. One of the second or third things after homelessness, solving the homelessness problem, the next practical thing that comes up is counseling, mental health counseling, sitting with the elderly so that they're not lonely or isolated. And so there's this perfect moment where the world sees it pretty clearly. Practicing Christians are along those same lines, seeing it the exact same way. So what is the opportunity for churches where we're not relying on the government to solve all these problems, but churches can maybe play a role in helping heal right now?
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, I think one of the most urgent needs I see is in the world of foster care. And you actually had some great organizations that learned to do training over Zoom this year. But obviously you can't Zoom foster parent. And they saw, some of these places actually saw a big increase in the number of volunteers. People who were suddenly found that they were working from home more often, that they had more flexibility in their schedule, were able to take in children when they couldn't before. So there are some, positive stories that have come out of this year, and a lot of those positive stories have come out of the church, frankly. I think that a lot of churches that did move into this kind of virtual help, thing, I think that there is some good to be done there, but I worry that that's going to become a crutch, that people are going to say, oh, well, we could just have our Zoom meeting, or we could just have our Zoom support group, and isn't that more convenient? It's not the same. And, everything we know about time on screens for adults and kids shows that it does not have the same effect on people's well-being, on their feelings about life and the future. And so I would caution people who think like this is a great thing. I mean, I'm glad all of the people who are watching can watch us virtually, but I hope that they'll all be able to come back in person next year because it's a different experience.
Yeah, we need one another more than ever. And I think if there's a positive that's come out of experiencing lockdown in the way that it went down this year, and we know certain states have had it much more difficult than others, it's that we need one another and we're better off with one another and we can't be alone. And the church is one of those places that and every community has the opportunity to continue to share that truth and to bring people together and serve people. Maybe if they don't even believe like you believe, it's our opportunity to show up. And I'm thankful for the work that you're doing. Just in closing, as you look at the year ahead, what are some of your hopes? I mean, you just mentioned one, that we'll get back together in rooms. As you think about schools, as you think about education, as you talk to people in this room, in this audience, who are presidents of colleges and they're leading schools, what would you say to them is critical as we start to think about the fall in terms of education and in terms of trying to make up any of the ground that's been lost?
Well, in terms of, just to speak to the parents, I would say this is the summer to really embrace your inner free range parent, get your kids out of the house, get them away from screens, put them in, sleepover camp, get them to be as independent and away from the couch as possible. In terms of education.
Let me just pause. Yeah. I guess part of what you've seen over the last year is there's been going back to the couch. It's video games. It's constant screen. Yeah. So if that was a problem before, it's exacerbated. Yeah. So you're saying swing the pendulum, get them outside, throw away the electronics, lock them in the safe.
Yes. Maybe let them come back in to go to the bathroom. But other than that, no. But in terms of education, I really think every parent out there who lives in a district where the school is not open needs to put all the pressure in the world on getting that school to be open. I think this has opened people's eyes to the need for more school choice, to understand that schools that serve parents and the interests of families are really important. And if your school is not going to do that, we need to find other alternatives. I think for college presidents, I think the importance of understanding, the value of in-person learning and being on campus and being in a community is really important. And as much as we like to talk about how great and convenient distance learning is, I think that, college students who are kind of hanging out in their dorms, just playing video games and studying occasionally has not necessarily been a great improvement on things.
Yeah. Well, we thank you for your work, faithfully not only doing the work, but then educating us, helping us see these disparities, helping expose them, helping more leaders and teachers, doctors understand the critical role they play in our communities, but also our churches. And so we appreciate you being with us today. Let's thank Naomi.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to all of these conversations. I know it was a variety of opinions. There was a lot of back and forth. There was some disagreement. You could also see some alignment on this conversation. For us, we just want you to think well. We want you to have access to good information. We want you to hear from sources, and we want you to better understand how to investigate for yourself and learn how is it that you as a leader can respond. How can we be thoughtful? How can we have discourse? You heard Dr. Kulldorff said, if science doesn't work when we don't have open conversation. And that's one of the challenges of this moment, especially as we want to pursue good ideas, is we must be willing to take into account various opinions. We have to hear from different people so that we come to the best conclusions. That is our opportunity in a moment like this, is to learn from one another and to move forward with more wisdom. And so as you go forward, if you want to continue watching this particular talk, remember you can get that free trial on Q Media at qideas.org/trial. And you'll have access not only to this talk, but many other talks that took place at the Culture Summit. Now, if you're interested in hearing all 40 talks from the Culture Summit and having access to that immediately, you can do that by going to qideas.org/culture summit. You can see all the different speakers and topics that we addressed this year in our 2-day event. And for $49, you can get instant access to that. Watch it with your small group. Watch it with those that you're spending time with this summer. There were so many amazing topics and conversations. The feedback we received as a team that this was the most compelling, the best Q conference we've ever done. And so we're so thankful for that. And we hope this just continues to equip and help you as you navigate the season ahead.